Hey guys, it's Robert Wasman from the Journalistic Revolution in the World Through the Trivium. I am going to try and play the intro and hopefully it will come through. So here's the intro to the World Through the Trivium. And I hopefully that went through for everybody and everybody got to hear it just fine. Again, let me turn myself down here. I am your host, Robert Wasman. I'm from the Journalistic Revolution, also here at the Voluntary Virtues Network. You're listening to us, or watching me rather, through the Voluntary Virtues Network, or you can be listening in through the TuneIn app by searching JRev Radio or going over to jrevradio.com and listening to us. So welcome all the fans. For those who don't know the show through the gunshots, for those who don't know, the word through the Trivium is a pet project of mine because I believe that the Trivium is one of the most effective methods in which to teach yourself how to think, if that makes any sense. And so just to give a recap for those who didn't watch the last episode or those who didn't know um, what the trivium is, just a quick little recap. The trivium methods pertaining to the mind is the elementary three: general grammar, Aristotle's logic, and classical rhetoric comprise the first three rules-based subjects of the seven liberal arts and sciences. As these disciplines are learned and practiced together, they form the overreaching symbiotic system of establishing clarity and consistency of personal thought, and it's called the trivium. General grammar, discovering and ordering facts and reality comprise basic and systematic knowledge, answering the who, what, where, and when of a subject. Formal logic, answering the why of a subject, developing the faculty of reasoning in establishing valid, i.e. non-contradictory, relationships amongst facts and systematic understanding. And then, of course, classical rhetoric provides the how of a subject, applying knowledge and understanding expressively comprises wisdom, or in other words, is the systematic usable knowledge and understanding, systematically using knowledge and understanding. So the trivium is a method of thinking. It's kind of like objectivism or libertarianism. It's a philosophy, a body of knowledge, which determines to make your life better and the world a better place. Um, you can even say anarchy follows along those lines. But I say that the trivium is the basis for any good philosophy, and that people either knowingly or unknowingly already use it, especially the great thinkers of our times. But this episode is about logical fallacies. It's a subject that's not brought up enough, and I'm probably going to surprise you towards the end of this little lesson, if you will, about logical fallacies. It's the first you have to know what they are. You have to know what they are not. You have to know how to identify them. You have to know how to defend against them, and you have to know what they truly mean. And so, we're going to jump into that, one place you can go if you're interested in looking up into it is yourlogicalfallacyis.com. This is one of my favorite memes to post when somebody is just not making any sense for the not making any sense during a discussion or a debate. But a logical fallacy is, roughly speaking, an error of reasoning. When someone adopts a position or tries to persuade someone to adopt a position based on a bad piece of reasoning, they commit a fallacy. And I say roughly speaking because this definition has a few problems, the most important of which we'll talk about later. Some logical fallacies are more common than others, and so have been named and defined. When people speak of logical fallacies, they often mean to refer to this collection of well-known errors of reasoning rather than to fallacies in the broader, more technical sense. The ability to identify logical fallacies in the arguments of others and to avoid them in one's own argument is both valuable and increasingly rare. Fallacious reasoning keeps us from knowing the truth, and the inability to think critically makes us vulnerable to manipulation by those skilled in the art of rhetoric. Rhetoric, as you know, is one of the steps in the Trivium. If you can be amazing at rhetoric and have no basis in grammar or logic whatsoever, you can also, for that same matter, be amazing at logic and have no basis in grammar or rhetoric, and so forth and down the ladder. Just because you're good at one does not mean that you are well at the others. Now, there are formal and informal fallacies. We talked about what a fallacy is. A fallacy is an error of reasoning. It's a logical jump that went from point A to point C without first going through B. But what a fallacy is not necessarily meaning you're wrong. That it is not an end-all be-all of the argument. Hey, you used a fallacy, so therefore your entire argument is debunked. No, it's just an error in reasoning. Just because someone uses a fallacy does not necessarily mean that the position in which they are taking is incorrect. It just means the means in which they came to that position was incorrect. There are several different ways in which fallacies may be categorized. It's possible, for instance, to distinguish between formal and informal fallacies. Formal fallacies, or deductive fallacies, are two types of well, first let me say that philosophers distinguish between two types of arguments. You have the deductive and the inductive. For each type of argument, there is a different understanding of what counts as a fallacy. Deductive arguments are supposed to be watertight. Okay, for a deductive argument to be a good one, to be valid, to be positive, it must be absolutely impossible for both its premise to be true and its conclusion to be false. With a good deductive argument, that simply just cannot happen. The truth of the premise entails the truth of the conclusion. The classic example, if you've ever taken a philosophy class or studied philosophy even as a hobby, you've probably run into this. This is a valid argument. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. It is simply not possible that both A and B are true and C is false. So the argument is deductively valid. A is true, B is true, so therefore C is true. Any deductive argument that fails to meet this standard commits a logical error, and so technically it is fallacious or fallacious. I screw up words all the time. You're just gonna have to deal with it. This includes many arguments that we would usually perceive as good arguments, arguments that make their conclusions highly probable but not certain. Arguments of this kind, arguments that aren't deductively valid, are said to commit a formal fallacy. So what's an informal fallacy? Inductive arguments needn't be as rigorous as deductive arguments in order to be good arguments. Good inductive arguments lend support to their conclusions, but even if the premises are true, then it doesn't establish it with 100% certainty that the conclusion is true. A good inductive argument with true premise might have a false conclusion, and that argument is a good one and its premises are true only establishes that the conclusion is probably true. All inductive arguments, even good ones, are therefore deductively invalid, and so they're fallacies in the strictest sense. The premise of an inductive argument do not and are not intended to entail the truth of the argument's conclusion. And so even the best inductive argument falls short of the deductive validity. Because all inductive arguments are technically invalid, different terminology is needed to be distinguished between good and bad inductive arguments than being done as good and bad deductive arguments. Else every inductive argument would be given the label bad and is invalid, and we would never get anywhere as far as philosophies go. The term most often used to distinguish good and bad inductive arguments are strong and weak. Oh man, that argument's weak, or he's got a strong point. An example of a strong inductive argument would be, every day to date, the law of gravity has held. Therefore, the law of gravity will hold tomorrow. Now, that argument fails to meet the standards required of inductive arguments to commit fallacies in addition to the formal fallacy it's already made. And these informal fallacies that are most often described by guides to good thinking, and that are the primary concern of most critical thinkers and critical thinking courses. So, and then this is not to be mistaken. These fallacies are not to be mistaken with logical and factual errors. Arguments consist of premises, inferences, and conclusions. Arguments containing bad inferences, like an example where the premises doesn't give adequate support for the conclusion drawn, can certainly be called a fallacy. What is less clear is whether arguments containing false premises, but which are otherwise fine, should be called a fallacy. If a fallacy is an error of reasoning, then strictly speaking, such arguments are not a fallacy. Their reasoning, their logic is sound. However, many of the traditional fallacies are of just this kind. They're informal. It's best, therefore, to define fallacy in a way that includes them as false. Both logical and factual errors, including both formal and informal, are both logical and factually incorrect. For instance, the state produces good would be a factual error. It doesn't actually produce anything. And a logical fallacy would be, well, there's bad people in the world, so we need to elect bad people to keep the bad people in check. It's circular logic. It falls short. So that is the difference, okay? I'm going to spend a little bit more time on it. Formal fallacies, just to go over this one more time, is factual. It's factually incorrect. It is not certain. It does not provide certainty. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. That's certain. There is gravity yesterday, there is gravity today, so there will be gravity tomorrow. That is not technically factual. We don't have any evidence. Now, moving it into the informal discussion, it definitely holds water. I mean, one can assume, and it has a very strong argument, that yes, there will be gravity tomorrow. We have a pretty good pattern of consistency here. But it does not mean that. But we do know all men die. And yeah, it's pretty much a fact. But unless you believe certain people come back to life or step outside the wheel of rebirth, but that's on you to figure that out. Now, I want to talk about the different types of fallacies. Okay, now, first one I want to talk about is the most used fallacy I think I've ever run across, and it's the ad hominem, or the personal attack. It is important to note that the label ad hominem is ambiguous, and not every kind of ad hominem argument is a fallacy. In one sense, an ad hominem argument is an argument in which you offer premises that your arguer don't accept, but which the listener does accept, in order to show that his position is incoherent, as in an example of the Euthyphro dilemma. I think I'm saying that right. There's nothing wrong with this type of argument ad hominem. The other type of ad hominem, the one that we run into often is a form of the genetic fallacy. Arguments of this kind focus not on the evidence for a view, but on the character of the person advancing it. They seek to discredit positions by discrediting those who hold them. It's always important to attack arguments rather than arguers, and this is where arguments that commit the ad hominem fallacy fall down. Example, William argues that modern biology supports the idea that there is an intelligent designer who created life. William would say that that's because he's religious, and modern biology doesn't support intelligent design. So the argument rejects the view that intelligent design is supported by modern science based on the remark that the person advancing the view is engaged in religion and not modern biology. It ignores the argument, focusing only on the arguer, and then therefore is technically an ad hominem. So again, I mean, most of these, I'm just giving these examples not because I don't want it to turn into a flame war to talk about intelligent design in the comments, but because I don't necessarily believe in one way or the other, and I don't feel like that's not what this show's about. But the point is that if you're attacking the person just because they are religious, doesn't mean their argument is invalid, and you're probably doing yourself a disservice if anybody is listening to your argument and you go straight for the ad hominem. The next type of logical fallacy, the bandwagon fallacy. The bandwagon fallacy is committed. Oh, by the way, the name gets it gets the term, the bandwagon fallacy, from back in the old days when you wanted to get everybody's attention, or you wanted to be elected, or you were trying to push a movement forward, or anything to that effect. You would literally get a band on a wagon and drive it through town to grab everybody's attention, and everybody would tend to follow. The bandwagon fallacy is committed by arguments that appeal to the growing popularity of an idea as a reason for accepting that it's true. They take the mere fact that the idea is suddenly attracting adherents as a reason for us to join with the trend, and becomes the adherents of the ideas ourselves. This is a fallacy because there are many other features of ideas than truth that can lead to rapid increase in popularity. Peer pressure, tangible benefits, or even mass stupidity could lead to a false idea being adopted by lots of people. Burning witches at stakes. A rise in the popularity of an idea is then no guarantee of it as truth. The bandwagon fallacy is closely related to the appeal to popularity. The difference between the two is that the bandwagon fallacy places an emphasis on the current fads and trends, on the growing support of an idea, whereas the appeal to popularity does not. An example, interestingly, people are coming to believe that Eastern religions help us get in touch with our true inner being. Therefore, Eastern religions help us get in touch with our true inner being. Just because the Eastern religions are getting more and more popular does not necessarily mean they're true. It doesn't mean any religion is true, but you see my point. This argument commits the bandwagon fallacy because it appeals to the mere fact that the idea is fashionable as evidence that it is true. Mere trends in thought are not reliable guides to truth, though. The fact that Eastern religions are becoming more fashionable does not imply that they are in fact true. You can take that and you can put any of these other bandwagon issues that are coming up nowadays. Global warming, even chemtrails to a certain degree. I know I'm going to get a little hate for that, but I do subscribe to the chemtrail theory. I just maybe not to the degree that everybody else does. So the point is just because a lot of people are talking about it, just because a lot of people are agreeing with something, does not necessarily make it true. The fallacy of composition. Okay, the fallacy of composition is the fallacy of inferring from the fact that every part of a whole has a given property that the whole also has that property. This pattern of argument is the reverse of the fallacy of division. It is not always a fallacy, but we must be cautious when making inferences in this form. An example, a clear case of this fallacy of composition is in this. Every song on the album lasts less than an hour. Therefore, the album lasts less than an hour. You're assuming because the smaller parts of the whole make up the whole. Obviously, the album consisting of many short tracks can by itself be very long. Not all arguments of this form are a fallacy, however. Whether or not they are depends on what property is involved. Some properties, such as lasting less than an hour, may be possessed by every part of something, but not by the entire thing itself. Others, such as being bigger than a bus, must be possessed by the whole if possessed by each part. So there is some truth to it. So it's really in a way in which it is used, and you're talking about the property in question. I'll skip the fallacy of division. Well, no, I won't. I'll go over it just really quick. You know, it's the reverse of composition. It's committed by the inferences that the fact that a whole has a property to the conclusion that part of the whole also has that property. Exact opposite. Just because the smaller pieces have it, the bigger piece must therefore have it. And this is the opposite, because the bigger piece has it, therefore the smaller pieces must have it. An example, water is liquid, therefore H2O molecules are liquid. We know that this simply just not be true. The argument in attributing to a macro property of water liquidity to its constituent parts commits the fallacy of division. Though water is a liquid, individual molecules, we know, are in fact not. The gambler's fallacy. This one we see used a lot in mainstream media, even though it doesn't seem like it's a gambler's fallacy at the time. The gambler's fallacy is the fallacy of assuming that short-term deviations from probability will be corrected in the short term. Faced with a series of events that are statistically unlikely, say a series of 9 coin tosses that have landed heads up, it is very tempting to expect that the next coin toss is going to land tails up. The past series of results, though, have no effect on the probability of the various possible outcomes of the next coin toss. The reason that we're using the coin toss as a good example is because there is literally 50-50 every single time you flip the coin. You have a 50% chance of it going either way. So the inference of this example of the gambler's fallacy is that when a fair coin is tossed, the probability of it landing on its head is 50%. The probability of it landing on its tails is 50%. These probabilities are unaffected by the results of the previous tosses. The gambler's fallacy appears to be a reasonable way of thinking that we know that the coin toss 10 times is very unlikely to land heads up every time. If we observe a tossed coin landing heads up 9 times in a row, we therefore, because we're not the best thinking animals in the world, or we are, and that's a sad fact, infer that in that unlikely sequence it will not continue, and then that the next coin will be tails up. In fact, though, the probability of the coin landing heads up on the 10th toss is exactly the same as it was on the first toss. That's probability, the laws of probability. So and what you see with this is a perfect example is the massive gun killings that are going on, that actually have been always going on throughout all of history, but that's another subject. But that's just it, is because there was a gun shooting last week, that means, and there was a gun shooting, I think it was a month before that, and there was a gun shooting 6 months before that, that means that there will be, we see this continuing going on, that, if we just make one more sign that says no guns allowed, they'll get it this time. And then they'll stop. I think I just used a horrible example. You guys can eat me alive on that in the comments. But genetic fallacy. I kind of went over this when I was talking about ad hominems. The genetic fallacy is committed when an idea is either accepted or rejected because of its source rather than its merit. Even from bad things, good may come. Wisdom is wisdom, whether it's from the mouth of fools or from the mouth of kings. I just used the word kings on a voluntary network. We therefore ought to not reject an idea just because of where it comes from, just like an ad hominem does. Equally, even good sources may say sometimes produce bad results. Accepting an idea because of the goodness of its source is also an appeal to authority. Therefore, it is no better than rejecting an idea because of the badness of the source. Both types of arguments are a fallacy. Example, my mommy told me that the tooth fairy is real. Therefore, the tooth fairy is real. Eugenics was pioneered by Germany during the war. Therefore, eugenics is a bad thing. Um, Again, regardless of how true these statements may be, in the conclusion, the logic is false, and you can't call yourself